He's also got 2 copies of Scavenging Ooze, if you can get to that. That's problematic for Goryo's Vengeance. But he's also got a lot of stuff like Tarmogoyf and Maelstrom Pulse and Huntmaster of the Fells that are close to dead cards in the matchup. If Joe has a functioning hand, a lot of these cards do very little.
All right, so Bruce is going to go ahead and start just on a Verdant Catacombs, and we get to see where Joe starts. It's a Gemstone Mine into Faithless Looting. Now, you have to watch out for the early turns with this deck. Joe can win without wasting any time.
And what I really like about this deck is 4 copies of Izzet Charm. Izzet Charm is very powerful as a looting effect. It's also a way to push through your combo against counter spells, so very flexible card.
Interesting here, so Joe is going to be hesitant to put a creature in a graveyard unless he can reanimate it right away. So you mentioned Scavenging Ooze, the card that stops Joe's entire combo. Actually, Joe can kill it with Izzet Charm, mainly because creatures that rarely end up in either player's graveyard in this matchup. Joe's not killing anything, and he rarely bins creatures of his own. Here, though, you see he discards Gristlebrand and a copy of Pull from Eternity. And Pull from Eternity takes a card from exile and puts it into the graveyard. And Joe actually puts cards there. He plays Gemstone Caverns, Fury of the Horde. Those all put cards in exile, as well as Serum Powder. But he didn't do Serum Powder or Caverns in his opener, so Pull not a good card, which is why he's discarding it.
Yep. Now, Scavenging Ooze, as you mentioned, Joe's going to avoid trying to put something in the graveyard until he actually can go. Scavenging Ooze with green mana up can kind of muck things up.
So if Bruce had an Ooze here, he would force Joe to try to combo next turn. But instead he has Tarmogoyf. We do see creature, instant, and sorcery and land, so it's already a 4/5.
But if you look at this deck, I mean, it's a lot of staple or cards you could imagine being staples of busted legacy decks.
All right, so here's Goryo's Vengeance. This is one of the things that Joe wants to do. He was playing pretty fair here. It's going to come into play. Gristlebrand will swing for 7 with lifelink and haste. Now we'll see whether or not Joe can just win this turn. As you mentioned, this is the fast combo deck of the format.
And you're saying another reason for Pull from Eternity being in the deck is that Gristlebrand gets exiled here. So in the event that Joe isn't able to kill this turn, if he finds Pull from Eternity, he can put Gristlebrand back into the graveyard and be able to reanimate it down the line.
So you see here, Joe went up to 27 on that attack. Now he's going to draw 7. It is almost certain that this is the last turn of the game.
Yep.
Joe's going to but it's fun to see in action. So Joe goes down to 20. Now he's going to go down to 13 to draw 7 more. I assume he goes all the way down to 6 just to find copies of Fury of the Horde and red cards.
Yeah, and it looks like he's found a Fury of the Horde here, so
the deck actually is not flush on red cards, so there's a lot of resources that go on here. But when he finds one, he can exile 2 cards or other red cards in his hand to cast Fury of the Horde for free, which is what he's going to do now, and means that he gets to untap Gristlebrand and have another attack phase.
Which is 7 more cards, another opportunity to find Fury of the Horde and the corresponding red cards and just try to kill in one shot. And even if he fails to kill this turn, he can try to set up, Pull from Eternity plus a reanimation spell for next turn and go for it again, or simply discard another copy of Gristlebrand that's in his hand, what have you.
And you see 2 Through the Breaches are exiled there, so Gristlebrand gets to untap and he attacks again. Bruce goes to 5. Joe draws 7 more. So he went up to 20 again from Gristlebrand's lifelink hit. Looks like he's found another Fury and 2 more red cards, so that's going to be a lethal attack. Bruce is dead, played a Tarmogoyf, but that was not enough. Game 1 goes over to Joe Lossett.
And Joe, looking at the camera, giving a little
he knows it.
Cool me off gesture there. And yeah, that's why you can see, Goryo's Vengeance is pushing the boundaries of what should be permissible in the modern format, even if the deck has not put up particularly good results. Because that was a turn 2 kill. And
it didn't take that much.
A turn 2 kill that's very hard for most decks to interact with, unless your opponent had a counter spell at the ready there, or a discard spell, or some way to interact with the graveyard.
Thoughtseize.
Yeah. I mean, Bruce just played a Tarmogoyf on turn 2 and did not get to untap. That's something that very, very rarely happens in Modern.
Yeah, I believe, like I said before, I believe this is one of this and Goryo's Vengeance and Amulet are the decks that can turn 2 and turn 1. They're both Simian Spirit Guide decks. I think that the dangers, I'm going to throw this out here, is that a deck like Amulet requires, it is actually very powerful and maybe is also pushing that boundary. Goryo's Vengeance can do it with fewer cards. That said, the cards you have to put in your deck to make this engine work are a lot more questionable.
You have a higher fail rate. You have a lot more games where you're getting down to 4 and just sort of dying than a lot of the other
Your hands
decks.
look real bad sometimes.
But your really good draws are really good, and we just saw that on display game 1.
All right, so let's look at the players' sideboards here. So we'll start with Bruce. This one's pretty easy because he's got a lot of cards that he just doesn't want anywhere near the matchup.
A Sowing Salt, a Rending Volley, a Grafdigger's Cage, a Feed the Clan, 2 Obstinate Battle-Off, an Outpost Siege, an Olivia Valderin, a Grim Lavamancer, an Ancient Grudge, a Golgari Charm, a Shatterstorm, and 3 Fulminator Mage. I mean, there's not a whole lot going on here. There's a Grafdigger's Cage. That's very
great.
good.
Yeah.
But other than that, I mean, this is a pretty light sideboard for the matchup.
Yeah, it looks like it's really just one card. There's not much else he can use.
Yeah, I mean, he can bring in things like his copy of Grim Lavamancer and try to speed it up a little bit, remove some of his clunkier threats like Hummaster, but this is trouble for Bruce.
All right. Well, before we go to Joe's sideboard, one thing we now have, which is the StarCityGames.com newsletter that we're going to tell you about. If you guys have not been subscribed, this is members of Premium. We now have a weekly newsletter.
Yeah, and this is a great synopsis of everything that's been going on the website. It gets released every single week. There's content that Cedric Phillips selects both from the premium and the select side to recommend for you. There's a exclusive cardboard crack comic. There's some articles from writers like we've had Nick Miller, like we've had Ed Irwin talk about what they would do for Friday Night Magic. There's just a lot of good content in the newsletter. It's very easy to get signed up for. You can go to the website and sign up on the top banner. This comes every week, and it's a very good summary of the content that's available and some content that's exclusive to the newsletter.
Yeah, this is something that I believe, yeah, we've had newsletters in the past with Premium, but this is really, I really like where this is going.
Right, it's a great, I mean, I don't necessarily go to the website every single day, but every time this comes into my inbox, I check it out. There's usually a good recommendation or two for articles, the cardboard crack comic, the crossword puzzle. It's just a good, brief summary of what's going on the website.
All right, so looking at Joe Lossett's sideboard, so we kind of talked about what Bruce can do. He has 2 copies actually of Leyline of Sanctity in his main deck, so he has 2 more in his sideboard. Against a discard-heavy deck like Jund's, that's Jund's main way of interacting here, I would expect him to use that. The other kind of cards he has in his sideboard, he has a Gemstone Mine, which he has 1 extra land. He has 4 copies of Silence. He has a Back to Nature, a Pyroclasm, 3 Torpor Orb, and 3 Thought Ceases of his own. Now, I expect him to use these other Leylines to fight against Bruce's discard. But outside of that, I mean, when you have such a streamlined combo deck, you're really just targeting individual decks with your sideboard. Silence looks like it would be for blue decks for the primarily, Torpor Orb for decks like Twin, Thoughtseize, perhaps against other sort of synergy-based decks, but other than the Leylines, I don't see too much that Joe will go toward.
I agree. I mean, yes, you can make an argument for Thoughtseize to attack Bruce's discard spells, but I think the cost of sideboarding in this deck is very heavy because this deck is almost all engine. There's very little fat. So I think Joe goes up to the full play set of Leylines, try to lock out the discard spells, but beyond that, I think Joe probably doesn't touch a sideboard here.
Remember, the turn 0 here matters. Joe, post board with up to 4 copies of Leyline of Sanctity and 3 copies of Serum Powder, often does have pre-game actions of his own.
Yeah. I mean, if you like playing Legacy, this is the closest you can get to playing Legacy in Modern, in my opinion. It's a lot of the same elements. You see a lot of the same cards here, really using the graveyard as a resource, trying to generate some explosive kills.
You see Joe using Serum Powder to take a new hand. He exiles those 7. Now, this is where those copies of Pull from Eternity can come into play. If Joe exiles a creature there, that does let him entomb a creature, if you will.
A lot of synergies here.
I think Bruce will want to check what's in there. We see some lands. There is a Gristlebrand hanging out. Joe's new 7's a keeper, and now another pregame action will put Leyline of Sanctity into play.
Pretty good opening here for Joe, to say the least.
But Bruce with the 1 out of the sideboard, he starts the game on Grafdigger's Cage. That is an easy keep for Bruce, and one that Joe's going to have a very difficult time beating.
Yeah, there's Through the Breach as a way to kind of get around it, but his graveyard, I believe, is likely shut off here. I don't think he has a way to get that card off of the table. I suppose he can Through the Breach, Emrakul, and then go from there, but...
Yeah, so now he'll have to use his copies of Through the Breach. A lot of his deck is turned off. The Glorious Vengeances don't do anything. When it comes to getting up to 5 mana for Through the Breach, he's going to look to cards like his 3 of Pentad Prism and cards like Simian Spirit Guide. He's only an 18-land deck, so casting a 5 mana Through the Breach could be pretty difficult.
Pentad Prism is a very good route, though.
Yeah, that'll get him to 5 very quickly.
And he's going to be able to set up Through the Breach pretty much uncontested because of Leyline. So this is a really good opening here for Bruce, but it still may not matter.
I believe Joe does have a copy of Through the Breach. I don't know what monster he has in his hand to put into play, so if he has one at all. But Through the Breach is waiting. As Scavenging Ooze starts beating in, Joe goes down to 17, taking 1 off that mana confluence as well. Now let's see, does he have a creature to put into play? Looks like he may have a Gristlebrand. Yeah, it looks, you see him shuffling a Gristlebrand up to the front. Does have 5 mana, so now I just think what could go wrong if he goes for Gristlebrand? Off 2 mana on Bruce's side. He does have the mana for Terminate. But Joe's going to go for it. Here's Through the Breach. Here comes Gristlebrand. It's not Emrakul. That's good news for Bruce. Here's an attack. See if Bruce does have a card like Terminate. It does not appear so, though. Bruce goes down to 13, and Joe up to 24. He's going to get to draw 21 here, and he may just be able to end the game.
Well, I think the issue may be Twilight Mire as the land over on Bruce's side of the table.
Oh, you're right. That's actually, it's not an Overgrown Tomb.
Yep.
He can't make, you're right. So he doesn't have a kill spell that could take care of Gristlebrand.
Yeah, he has Terminate in hand.
Wow. Okay.
And this was the cost. Last turn, Bruce played Treetop Village in lieu of Swamp. He could have had Terminate mana available. He may have overestimated how safe he was here.
Yeah, he goes down to 13. Joe draws 7. Goes so up to 24. Deck down to 17. He's going to need to find two Rally the Hordes, or Fury of the Hordes, and then 4 other red cards.
The other option is if Joe draws up a pretty potent hand here, he can just say, okay, whatever, untap and go for Through the Breach on Emrakul the following turn.
He'll draw 7 again, go to 10. Now, there is some danger about taking that last 7. If he goes to 3, he could get lightning bolted. I don't think we'll see Joe do that. Well, we may. No, wait, he has Leyline. He has Leyline.
Yeah, but he is facing out a Treetop Village, so he's not going to be pushing himself to 5 or lower, and probably even higher than that because of the mana confluence he needs as mana.
So here's a Fury of the Horde he has found. Does have some number of Izzet Charms and Faithless Lootings. Should be able to discard it.
This is looking like potentially a turn 3 kill against Grafdigger's Cage on the heels of a turn 2 kill.
Yeah. And it'll go one more. Bruce down to 6, Joe up to 16. He's just gonna have to find another Fury. Joe goes down to, he's gonna activate, go down to 9. Does he find another Fury of the Horde? Simian Spirit Guide, Goryo's Vengeance, Faithless Looting. I don't know if he has the next Fury.
So then the question becomes, does he have a hand that's good enough to the point where he doesn't have to bother trying to go for the kill this turn? And if he's setting aside 7 here, I think Joe's saying, I'm not going to push my luck this turn and just go for the kill next turn.
Well, he can use that Spirit Guide to cast Faithless Looting if he wants to take another shot at it. There is some worry that if he lets Bruce on tap, he opens up the door to cards like Maelstrom Pulse. That said, if Joe has a good enough setup here, he doesn't really have to care.
I think that if he's got a land, a Simian Spirit Guide, a Through the Breach, and something to put into play, especially Emrakul, that's going to be good enough for Joe to win. He doesn't have to get too greedy here.
Yeah, him going to 0, especially when he can't take burn to the face, is probably, it's very unlikely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like he'll keep Bruce to 6. Yeah, once he puts Emrakul Through the Breach, that will play around any of Bruce's removal.
But I don't think Joe's going to get too risky here. He's looked at so much of his deck that I would imagine assembling the kill for next turn is not going to be too hard.
See it here, a lot of discards there. You're right, Simian Spirit Guide, Through the Breach, Emrakul appear to be what Joe has kept.
Very solid set of cards here.
And that's the scary part. When you have a deck that's this fast of a combo deck, there's so much pressure that you put on your opponent. And we mentioned the Treetop Village versus Swamp play from Bruce, or even perhaps playing Twilight Mire instead of Swamp. I mean, he needed to do that so he could play Scavenging Ooze, but that one situation is enough that it may have cost Bruce the game.
And that's something you see more in large formats like Modern and like Legacy. People are not necessarily familiar with the decks that are on the fringes of the format. I think Bruce might have felt that he was just safe with Grafdigger's Cage. And he even saw it Through the Breach, I believe, in game 1 as Joe was going off with Fury of the Horde, but the total enormity of the situation I don't think registered.
And to be fair, if the creature that Joe puts Through the Breach is Emrakul instead of Gristlebrand, that doesn't even matter.
Yep. I mean, the question is how much is getting your Treetop Village into play matter. I think at the end of the day, it's not very much. Bruce would have been better served holding up Terminate, but that said, that's an advantage of playing a deck like this.
And Joe, one of the cards he lets go is an Emrakul. He's going to try to shuffle it in. And I think that should still shuffle, even with Grafdigger's Cage.
Yeah, I think Bruce. Yeah. Well, I think the thing is, Bruce is saying here that he's floated green off the Twilight Mire. He removed the Gristlebrand, and now I believe would like to exile the Emrakul as well.
With the trigger.
And now it's an issue of have we gone too far?
And it may be a situation here, even though Joe had started a shuffle, if the judge rules that Bruce still has the opportunity to remove Emrakul, they can actually fix this by just getting an Emrakul out of Joe's deck, because it would be functionally the same situation. It doesn't matter if it's the right Emrakul.
Right, there is
a fix.
There's been no scrying here. There's Joe doesn't know anything about the order of his deck.
He's just about to shuffle.
Exactly, yeah. There's nothing. This is an easy one to correct.
The question is whether or not Bruce missed the window to exile Emrakul. It doesn't appear that it will affect the outcome of the game. The big thing I think what Bruce wants is he wants the extra 1/1 counter on Scavenging Ooze.
Yeah.
If he could, this is interesting. If he had enough mana to get the Ooze up to a 5/5, Ooze plus Village could put Joe to 1, and Joe wouldn't be able to use the mana confluence.
Yeah.
Now, as it appears, he can put Joe to 2, but that's not going to be enough.
Right, and Joe still has to be worried. There's no lock that it doesn't matter here, because what if Bruce has random pump spells in his deck, or something weird can definitely happen here. So if Joe can save himself the +1/+1 counter on the Scavenging Ooze, he's well served to do so.
Yeah, but right now they're good. The judges will be on this one and figure out just what is going to happen with that Emrakul. So as it lies, there's an Emrakul trigger on the stack, perhaps. We don't know whether or not there was a chance to respond to it.
Still looking like a pretty solid situation there for Joe. I think he's got a hand that's solid enough to go off next turn. He still has Leyline of Sanctity in play, so his hand's protected from various discard spells. The Scavenging Ooze, even in the event that it is allowed to take the counter, will go up to a 4/4. With Treetop Village, that's 7. Joe will go into play to his next turn at 2, one presumes. 2 is enough where he can tap the mana confluence for mana, do his thing. So things are looking very solid for Joe, but not a lock just yet.
Well, as long as the land Joe kept isn't another mana confluence, which I presume he didn't, but that 4th land is actually tricky if you look at the lands in Joe's deck. He has 1 swamp and 3 gemstone mine. Those are fine, but the other ones, mana confluence, City of Brass, Blackcleave Cliffs, those don't actually work here. He needs land 4. Now, he saw a lot of cards, so I bet he's kept one that works.
I'm sure he has a hand that's capable of doing it, because he looked at 21 cards that turn, or whatever the case may be. He does have to be worried about potentially something like Maelstrom Pulse plus discard spell if Bruce is able to tag the ley line and then attack Joe's hand.
Sure.
So if Joe can leave his hand as redundant as possible, ideally 2 copies of Emrakul, 2 copies of Through the Breach, 2 copies of Simian Spear Guide in the land.
That would be Dossie's proof.
If he has that kind of recipe, I think Joe wants to have that, because it's not a lock that he doesn't get hit by a discard spell next turn. With that said, looks like a very solid position to be in, and we almost saw there a turn 3 kill through Grafdigger's Cage. This deck is capable of some very explosive openings.
It seems like right now that Bruce is playing on borrowed time. I almost would have expected that one to go all the way.
Yeah, this deck can get some very impressive draws. There's no two ways about it. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, it introduces a very interesting question, which is, we obviously see people die on turn 3 and before sometimes in Modern. Is it required for R&D to ban out of those decks every single time? Or are we willing to say, turn 4 is what we want kind of the powerful and consistent decks to be doing? If there's some volatile turn 3 kills, turn 2 kills roll in, maybe we're happy with those existing. I know there's the other side of the equation where people would just be happier if Gorgio's Vengeance wasn't part of the format at all, because all it does is facilitate the type of openings that we saw in Game 1. It's an interesting case study, because it is testing some of the philosophical parameters that R&D initially put on the format.
Well, I mean, and Blazing Shoal does remain on the banned list for this reason as well. And in Legacy, we have decks that can kill on turn 1, but we're generally okay with that, because there's a lot of fragileness to those decks.
Right. Force of Will exists in the format.
Yep.
And also, Legacy is more of, well, take the gloves off, and you want to wasteland lock people and kill on the first turn, and those kind of decks
you can do that.
We agree we have an agreement about what the rules of engagement are. Anything goes. Modern is supposed to be more of a PTQ format. It's supposed to be more of an F&M format. And so the parameters rightly change a little bit. We don't want the format to be all about turn 1 kills and locking people out with strip mine effects and so on. With that said, when the card pool expands, you are going to find these outlier cases. As the card pool gets bigger and bigger, usually it means decks kill faster, not slower, because synergies start manifesting and weird cards start interacting. And it's an interesting case study to see. Is the turn 3 or before is no good? Is that a firm, defined rule of the format? Or is R&D willing to say, we can let this go if the deck's not particularly good? For the time being, it seems that they are in the latter camp. But if Goryo's Vengeance starts picking up popularity, I think they're going to be much quicker to act against this sort of deck than, say, Splinter Twin or Birthing Pod or some of the other turn 4 decks that have defined the format at various points.
Now, do you think that the Goryo's Vengeance deck is different than something like Amulet Combo, which also has a turn 2 kill? Amulet Combo is a deck that has a turn 2 kill, but when it doesn't hit its turn 2 kill, actually plays a mid-range game. You know, it plays a fair-ish game of Magic where it's going, you know, it has this Teleria West engine, but it's slower and mid-rangier. Whereas Goryo's Vengeance is a deck that's really trying to turn 2 kill someone, and in case that fails, is trying to turn 3 them, and that's the game plan.
Amulet's best draws still at least involve a permanent that can be targeted by a variety of cards. And I think that puts the deck in a very different prism than something like Goryo's Vengeance, which is putting something in graveyard and taking it out. It's just easier to naturally interact with what Amulet's doing with its most explosive draws. Now, it can, as you mentioned, sort of turn and become a mid-range Primeval Titan deck.
Yeah, it's not always just like this fast combo deck. It has a fast combo element, but it's not devoted to it.
Amulet, at the end of the day, is still putting permanents into play that are pretty easy to target, and it's casting them out of its hand. And that, I think, is a very different case than something that's putting something into the graveyard and reanimating it. The modes of interaction that the average person has is just much more limited against something like Goryo's Vengeance than it is against something like Amulet Bloom. So it wouldn't surprise me if they took action on one, both, or neither deck over the course of Modern's history.
Sure.
And on the surface, they are very similar in the sort of philosophical test that they put on the format. With that said, I think that Amulet is definitely a more powerful deck, definitely has a better tournament pedigree at this point, but because it's involved casting spells out of the hand and winning with permanence that it's casting out of the hand, I think it's just a much different case study than something like Goryo's.
It does involve attacking with a 6-mana creature at one point, so, I mean, you can beat it with Path to Exiles, even.
Right, and that's a much harder thing to do, especially when Emrakul is involved with the kill. Or you have a removal spell for Gristlebrand, but the person's still drawing
they draw
a million
14,
cards.
You still lost.
You can still win games when your Primeval Titan gets killed because of the value it generates, but it's on a much different scope than something like Emrakul or Gristlebrand, which what they do is so front-loaded on the creature just entering play in the first place, not even necessarily connecting once.
All right, well, we have our judge call resolved, so we're going to bring you back into the match here. So it did turn out that an Emrakul was exiled from Joe's deck, so Bruce's Scavenging Ooze goes up to 4/4. Then Joe proceeds to shuffle. So we will go to Bruce's turn 4. He has 7 damage on the table, as we kind of alluded before. It's 1 short of the number he needs.
7 means very little here, because Joe can go into his turn at 2, be able to tap his Mana Confluence, and most likely generate a kill.
And with that ley line in play, there's not going to be too much burn that he could have. Now, Bruce is sitting on at least 1 copy of Thoughtseize. So can he Pulse and Thoughtseize? Does he have a way to get that enchantment off? 2 copies of Maelstrom Pulse in his deck. Scavenging Ooze will swing no village with it, so it will put Joe down to 5. And he is just going to pass the turn. Had the option of Huntmaster the Fells, but I think he's going to sit back on Terminate.
He's just hoping that it's Gristlebrand, and then Terminate does something.
Agree, though. I think he knows it's unlikely to be Gristlebrand. Here's 4 mana. Joe will go down to 4. Simian Spirit Guide will be mana 5. Here's another Through the Breach, and this time it's going to be the Eldrazi. Emrakul enters play, attacks, annihilates all 6 of Bruce's permanents, and his life total.
There is now no memory of Bruce participating in the game.
0 life points and 0 permanents.
The perfect.
If Bruce was can we call it the perfect if Bruce isn't at 15?
Well, he still has a graveyard too, so it's not
Okay,
quite.
so we
it's
didn't
not
get everything.
That's close enough. It's probably close enough for Joe's purposes.
Terminate, Huntmaster of the Fells, land, Thoughtseize, Bruce's hand. None of those will help him. He can't gain 8 life.
Even if he could, would he really want to?
If he had Feed the Clans right now, just went to 18.
Yeah.
And there you have it. 2-0 Joe Lossett moves on with Goryo's Vengeance. That's not a deck I expected to see this weekend.
This is a deck that is definitely worth looking out for. Because if this deck is good,
man.
if this deck is powerful, it's not going to stay around for very long. As long as it's something that's sort of cute and on the fringes of the format, R&D is likely to say, this is okay. We can let people do this sort of thing.
Well, that was something, like when